The morning she labeled me a mechanic's hack, I nearly stepped out of my own kid's world forever. I was standing in the entrance of a bistro I could never manage on my own white tablecloths, tapers, the sort of place where the water arrives in a bottle with a French name. My palms were tidy. I had rubbed them 3 times before exiting the house, but I guess the years leave something behind that soap can't reach, the calluses, the way I hold my shoulders, the truck I parked 2 blocks away because I was frustrated it would be seen out front. My son Marcus had told me to come at 7 o'clock. I arrived at 6:55. I heard her before I saw her. She was chatting to a woman in a red dress near the bar, and her voice carried the way confident people's voices always do, like the room exists to amplify them. And then she turned, and she saw me. And her smile stayed exactly the same size, but moved somewhere colder. And she leaned toward the woman in red and said it just loud enough. "Oh, the grease monkey is here." The woman in red laughed, a small laugh quickly covered, but I heard it. I stood there in my best button-down shirt, the blue one I'd bought for my wife's funeral 11 years ago, and wore maybe 3 times since. And I felt every one of my 64 years land on me at once. I thought about the drive home. I thought about how easy it would be to simply turn around, walk back to my truck, and call Marcus in the morning with some excuse about not feeling well. I took 1 step back, and then Marcus was there. I don't know where he came from. He moved through that room like he'd been watching for me, which I suppose he had. He put his hand on my arm, not grabbing, just resting it there, the way you steady something you don't want to fall. And he leaned close and said 4 words very quietly. "Dad, I need you." Not "please stay," not "don't make a scene." He said he needed me. My son, who was 31 years old and ran his own business, and had never once asked me for anything he couldn't handle himself, looked me in the eye and said he needed me to be in that room. So I stayed. That was 3 months before everything fell apart, before the truth about Gretchen Harlow and her family came out in a way that none of them saw coming, least of all her. I should tell you who I am before I tell you what happened. My name is Dennis Kowalski. I grew up in Millhaven, Ohio, a town that used to have a steel mill and a sense of purpose, and now mostly has memories of both. My father fixed engines for 40 years. His father before him fixed engines. I broke the chain slightly by opening my own shop instead of working for someone else, which my father considered an act of either courage or foolishness, depending on what year you asked him. Kowalski Auto, that's what the sign says. Has said it for 22 years. We're on the corner of Fletcher and Route 9 in a building I own outright on land I paid off in 2019. 3 bays, 2 full-time mechanics, 1 part-timer on weekends. Not glamorous. Not the kind of business that gets written up in magazines, but it's mine. Every bolt, every tool, every square foot of concrete floor mine. My wife Carol died of cancer when Marcus was 20. She fought it for 2 years. We spent those 2 years making sure Marcus knew every story, every memory, every piece of who we were as a family. She was more organized about dying than most people are about living. She made me promise to stay present for Marcus, even when I wanted to retreat. And I'm not a man who takes promises lightly. Marcus grew up in the shop on weekends. He can change oil, replace brake pads, diagnose an engine knock by sound alone, but his brain went in a different direction than mine. He studied finance, got a job with an investment firm in Columbus, and by the time he was 28, he was doing well enough that I stopped worrying about him almost entirely. Then he met Gretchen. He brought her to Millhaven the previous Christmas. She was pretty in the way that takes effort, the kind of pretty that has a budget behind it. She shook my hand at the door and looked around my house with a smile that said she was filing information away rather than enjoying the visit. "So this is where Marcus grew up," she said. It wasn't a question. It was the beginning of a catalog. Over dinner, she asked me about the shop, how many employees, what was the annual revenue, did I own the building or lease. She framed it as curiosity, as interest in Marcus's roots, but she wrote nothing down because she didn't need to. I could see her remembering. Marcus was glowing. He looked at her the way I used to look at Carol, like she was the proof that his life had turned out right. That look is hard to argue with. A father sees it, and he swallows every instinct he has, because he knows that instinct might be wrong, and love might be right, and the last thing a son needs is his father planting seeds of doubt about the woman he loves. So I swallowed it. I told her about the shop. I told her the building was paid off. I mentioned, because she asked twice, that I'd been talking to a county planner about the commercial corridor on Route 9, that there was some discussion about development in the area, though nothing certain. That was my mistake. Not the only one, but the one that started everything. His name was Richard Harlow, Gretchen's father. He appeared in Marcus's life about 6 weeks after Christmas, introduced first as a phone call, then as a lunch, then as a regular presence. He was a real estate investor from Cincinnati, the kind who buys distressed properties, flips them, sells to developers. He had a firm handshake and a memory like a vault. He remembered everything you told him about yourself and used it back on you later as a form of intimacy, as if knowing your details meant he cared about you. He and Gretchen were a system. I understand that now. She gathered information. He converted it into opportunity. They had done this before, not with Marcus specifically, but with men like Marcus, men who had built something or were connected to someone who had built something or stood to inherit something worth having. I didn't know any of this in January or February or March. What I knew in March was that Marcus had proposed, and Gretchen had said yes, and the engagement party was in 6 weeks at a restaurant called Harvest and Vine in Columbus, and I needed to press my good shirt. I've already told you how the evening started. What I haven't told you is what happened after Marcus said those 4 words, and I decided to stay. He guided me through the room with his hand still on my arm, introducing me to people I'd never met, colleagues of his, friends of Gretchen's, 2 of Richard Harlow's associates, who smiled with all their teeth and said it was a pleasure in a tone that suggested otherwise. Gretchen joined us after a few minutes, the coldness gone from her smile, replaced by something practiced and warm. "Dennis," she said, "not Mr. Kowalski, not Marcus's dad, just my first name, which I hadn't given her permission to use. I'm so glad you made it," as if my presence were a gift she'd requested and was graciously acknowledging. I said it was a wonderful party. I shook hands. I drank 1 glass of water and held a second one just to have something to do with my hands. And I watched. I watched Richard Harlow work the room. He moved from conversation to conversation like a man watering plants, a minute here, 2 minutes there, always leaving the other person smiling. When he reached me, he put both hands on my shoulders and called me the man of the hour, and asked how Route 9 was developing. I said I didn't know much more than I'd told him. He winked. "Modest," he said. "I like that." What I didn't know then, what Marcus knew and I didn't, was that Richard Harlow had already contacted the county development office twice using my name as a reference. He was trying to determine whether the commercial corridor project was real, whether Kowalski Auto sat in a valuable redevelopment zone, and whether a 64-year-old mechanic who'd built something by hand might be persuaded to sell or might have his decision made for him through a family arrangement he didn't fully understand. Marcus had found this out 3 weeks before the engagement party. He told me none of it that night. He only told me he needed me there. Later, much later, he explained why. "I needed them to think nothing had changed," he said. "If you'd walked out, they would have known something was wrong. I needed 1 more month." "1 more month for what?" I asked. He smiled. "To finish the paperwork." The month that followed felt like ordinary time. Marcus called twice a week, as he always did. Gretchen texted me links to articles about classic car restoration, a gesture so obviously coached that it almost made me sad for whoever had coached her. Richard Harlow drove through Millhaven one Tuesday afternoon and stopped by the shop just passing through, which is not something anyone does, because Millhaven is not on the way to anywhere. He spent 40 minutes in my shop asking questions about the business. He praised my work on a '67 Mustang I had in Bay 2. He mentioned 3 times, in 3 different ways, that he had connections with commercial developers who were always looking for established businesses with owned real estate. I answered his questions honestly, because I am not a man who lies. I own that building. I employ those men. I built that business. I'm not ashamed of it, and I won't pretend otherwise to make someone more comfortable with who I am. When he left, I called Marcus. "Gretchen's father came by the shop today," I said. "I know," Marcus said. "I know, Dad. I just need a little more time." I didn't push. I trusted him. That is the hardest thing I've ever done, harder than the mortgage, harder than the years after Carol died, harder than building a business from nothing in a town that was running out of reasons to stay. Trusting someone else to handle something that affected my life deeply, without knowing the plan, without being able to control the outcome. But Marcus had never given me a reason not to trust him, and he had asked me to, and so I did. The wedding was set for June. May arrived, and with it a meeting that Richard Harlow called informal, and Marcus told me to attend. It was at a steakhouse in Columbus. Myself, Richard, Gretchen, and Marcus. The supposed purpose was to discuss rehearsal dinner logistics. The actual purpose, I would later learn, was to get me to sign a document. Richard produced it over dessert, almost casually, a family investment agreement, he called it, a way to pool family assets to take advantage of the Route 9 development corridor. He'd had it drawn up by someone he called my guy. It was 11 pages long, and he offered me a pen before I'd read past the first paragraph. Just a formality, he said. Family taking care of family. I looked at Marcus. Marcus was looking at his father-in-law-to-be with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not shock, something more like recognition, the face of a man watching a thing happen exactly the way he expected it to. Richard, Marcus said, I think we should give my dad time to have his own attorney review that. Richard laughed. Of course, no rush. But the pen was still in his hand, extended toward me. No rush at all, Marcus said again, and his voice was different this time, steady, deliberate, the voice of a man who had rehearsed saying this exact thing. In fact, I've already asked someone to review it. Richard set the pen down. Gretchen looked at Marcus. The practiced warmth left her face for just a second, half a second, before she brought it back. But I saw it. The mask slipped and beneath it was something calculating and cold, and I understood in that moment that my son had been living alongside that coldness for months, studying it, preparing for it. You had it reviewed already? Richard said. Last week, Marcus said. Along with some other documents. The table was very quiet. What other documents? Gretchen asked. Marcus looked at her. He looked at her the way you look at someone you used to love or thought you did with something that might have been grief if there had been more time for grief, but had hardened into something more useful. The ones your father filed with the county, Marcus said. Using my grandfather's business as collateral on a development bid he submitted without my father's knowledge or consent. The steakhouse kept making its steakhouse sounds around us. Silverware, murmur, soft music, and at our table, total silence. That's not Richard started. I have the filing, Marcus said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. I have the correspondence. I have the emails you sent to two of his competitors offering to broker a forced sale, and I have a letter from the county clerk confirming that Kowalski Auto is not, in fact, located within the Route 9 development corridor. It never was. You were working from an outdated map. Richard Harlow had spent decades reading rooms. I watched him read this one. I watched him calculate the distance between where he was and where he needed to be and find that the distance was too far. Marcus, Gretchen said softly. Not to argue, almost like a question. Like she was asking which version of him this was. I think you should both know, Marcus said, that I've already spoken to an attorney about formally dissolving the engagement. The paperwork is complete. I wanted to do this in person because he paused, and for the first time his voice wavered, just slightly because my father deserved to see it. He looked at me. I don't have words for what that look felt like. I've tried to find them since. The closest I can come is this. It felt like Carol. It felt like the part of Carol that I had been most afraid was gone. Her certainty, her goodness, her refusal to let the world make her smaller. I had been raising him alone for 11 years thinking I might be doing it wrong. And in that moment I knew I had done at least one thing right. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. Richard Harlow stood up. He said something about lawyers and about misunderstandings and about how families work things out. Gretchen didn't stand. She sat very still, looking at nothing in particular, and I'm not sure, but I think she understood that this was the end of a version of herself she'd been building for a long time. They left. Marcus and I sat at that table for another hour. We didn't talk about what had happened, not right away. We ordered coffee. We talked about the Mustang in Bay 2. He asked if I needed help finishing the interior restoration. I said I could use an extra pair of hands on the weekend. I'll be there Saturday, he said. The development talk around Route 9 eventually did materialize 2 years later. Different corridor, different developer. Kowalski Auto wasn't in the zone, just as Marcus's research had confirmed. I didn't sell. I didn't need to. The shop runs fine. My guys are good. The '67 Mustang sold to a collector in Tennessee for more than I expected, and I put the money in a fund I'd been building for years without much fanfare. Richard Harlow's development firm faced a county inquiry that spring not because of anything Marcus or I filed, but because someone else had noticed the same pattern of fraudulent filings. I read about it in a regional business journal. 3 paragraphs. His name in the second one. Marcus met someone the following year. A woman named Patricia who teaches high school biology and laughs too loud at her own jokes, which is one of the best qualities a person can have. She came to the shop on a Tuesday just to see where Marcus grew up, and she walked around touching things, the tool chests, the hood of the Mustang I was working on, like she was reading a language. "Your dad built all of this," she said to Marcus. And it wasn't a question, and it wasn't a catalog. It was just recognition. I liked her immediately. There's a thing that happens in this business when an engine has been neglected for a long time. The damage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's invisible, a slow accumulation of pressure in the wrong places. Small failures that don't announce themselves until one day the whole system tells you it's done. The mistake people make is thinking the noise is the problem. The noise is just the engine telling you the truth it's been keeping. I've spent 40 years learning to listen for that truth before it becomes noise. My son learned to listen the same way. Not in a shop, in a relationship that was taking something from him quietly, in small amounts, the way a slow leak takes oil, not enough to notice on any given day, but enough to matter. He noticed. He listened, and then he did something I couldn't have done. He held his response until the right moment, till the timing was precise, until the damage could be stopped without destroying everything. I don't know if I taught him that. I'd like to think some of it came from watching me with an engine, the patience, the willingness to understand a problem fully before you touch it, the knowledge that a good repair is invisible. You don't see the work, only the result. What I know for certain is that he looked at me in the doorway on the worst moment of that night and told me he needed me, and I stayed. And everything that followed happened because I stayed. If something about that engagement party felt wrong from the beginning, and it did from the moment I heard that whisper, I'm glad I didn't let it send me home. I'm glad I trusted my son over my humiliation. I'm 64 years old. I've buried my father and my wife. I've made payroll in months I didn't know how I'd make it. I've rebuilt engines that other men gave up on. The hardest thing I ever did was stand still in that doorway and let my son lead. The best decision I ever made was the same. If you're watching this and something in your gut is telling you that the person who loves your family member doesn't actually love your family member, pay attention to that. Not with anger, not with ultimatums, just pay attention. Stay present. Be the kind of person your son or daughter can come back to with the truth. That's the whole lesson. It took me 64 years and one ruined engagement to understand it, but there it is. Be the kind of person they can come back to. That's all.